Welcome to the LCS-RNet 15th annual meeting entitled How Can We Accelerate Action to Stay Below 1.5 Degrees? We are pleased to start the first day of the meeting with opening remarks from the two speakers. Firstly, we would like to invite Haisa Yukihiro-san from Director Climate Change Science and Adaptation Office from the Ministry of the Environment Japan for the opening remarks. Haisa-san, the floor is yours.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Haisa Yukihiro, and I am a Director of the Climate Change Science and Adaptation Office at the Ministry of the Environment, Japan. I would like to first of all express my heartfelt thanks to all participants joining this LCS-RNet 15th annual meeting. The Leveraging a Climate-Neutral Society Strategic Research Network, or LCS-RNet for short, is a framework network of researchers and research institutions closely involved in national climate policies. The network was established following a Japanese proposal at the G8 Environment Ministers meeting in 2008, and the Ministry of the Environment of Japan has been supporting LCS-RNet activities from its inaugural stage. This year's annual meeting will feature 2 keynote speeches, 3 thematic sessions, and 1 panel discussion under the main theme, How can we accelerate action to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius? Today, we are honored to have Professor Jim Skea, Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, to deliver a keynote speech. After serving as a co-chair of Working Group 3 of the 6th Assessment Report, he was elected chairperson of the 7th Assessment Cycle in July 2023 and has been actively engaged since then. Professor Skea was also a keynote speaker at the Global Environment Action Conference held in Japan in October this year. I am very grateful that he is able to join us today, especially considering his demanding schedule. Just last week, he attended the scoping meeting of the AR7 working groups in Malaysia, which is a major task of the IPCC. After his keynote speech, Professor Skea will also participate in a question and answer session with participants, including young researchers. So thank you very much, Jim. The keynote speech on the second day will be delivered by Mr. Alexander Florentin, elected Councillor of Paris. The speech will be followed by a briefing and Q&A session on a report on Paris at 50 degrees, adapting to heat waves, which discusses how Paris has been impacted by extreme temperature rises due to climate change. The report also looks at the need for adaptation across environmental, societal, and infrastructure sectors. Here in Japan, we had another scorching summer with preliminary figures indicating that average temperatures between June and August had been the highest on record, following on from last year. I will be very interested to hear how the city of Paris has coped with the summer heat and what its plans are for future heat waves. I also think that the lessons learned in Paris will be very useful not only for Japan, but also for other cities around the world that are struggling with the heat in summer. I hope that participants from various cities will actively compare notes after the discussions at this annual meeting. There will also be 3 thematic sessions focusing on decarbonizing industry, agriculture and forestry in climate resilience strategy, and cities and the governance of climate resilience pathways. These will be followed by a panel discussion on integrating local policy and action. In the past, LCS-RNet discussions have focused mainly on mitigation, but this time we are broadening the discussion to include adaptation. In addition, we have included a presentation on farm-type solar power generation, looking at Japan as a case study. This initiative is very interesting and prominent in terms of promoting regional decarbonization. I would be delighted if discussions can go into the effectiveness of this initiative and its potential for application in countries and regions with growing economies such as Asia and Africa. I would like to take this opportunity to inform you that Dr. Kainuma Mikiko-san, Secretary General of the network and Senior Research Advisor to IGS, served as editor and compiled a special issue of Sustainability Science Journal earlier this year. Based on the discussions at this year's annual meeting, another special report will be issued. We hope that today's discussion and forthcoming report will contribute to the special report on climate change and cities of AR7 products. I hope that the network will open doors for many researchers, including young researchers, and expand further. Let me conclude by expressing my sincere hope that discussions at the sessions today and tomorrow will be rewarding and productive. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Heiser, for your opening remarks and encouragement. Now, we would like to invite Dr. Mikiko Kainuma, Secretary General of the LCS-RNet and Senior Research Advisor to IGS. Dr. Kainuma, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ishikawa-san. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I am Mikiko Kainuma. I serve as the Secretary General of the LCS-RNet. I'd like to first of all express my sincere gratitude of all participants joining the LCS-RNet 15th annual meeting. As Dr. Yukihiro Haisa mentioned earlier, this year's annual meeting will focus on how can we accelerate action to limit global warming to below 1.5 degrees. This year has been record-breaking temperature around the world. In particular, high temperatures have been recorded in the Middle East, North Africa, and the Southeast and West United States. Many extreme weather events and their impact, such as heavy rainfall, water shortage, and forest fires, have also been observed. Climate change is also currently approaching the limits of planetary boundaries, and some scientists believe it has already crossed them. The melting of ice sheets in Greenland and West Antarctica is causing sea level rise along with rising sea temperatures. Northern permafrost is melting in parts. This is causing various problems such as the release of greenhouse gases, the deterioration of stability of Earth's surface, and the impacts of ecosystems. Limiting the global temperature rise to below 1.5 is an extremely challenging task. Even if all the nationally determined contributions of each country are fully implemented, the expected greenhouse gas emissions reductions by 2030 will be far from the pathways needed to achieve 1.5 degree target. Accelerating greenhouse gas reduction will require not only government efforts, but also action at the level of cities, rural areas, industries, and citizens. Decarbonization efforts are underway in many cities, including Freiburg, Copenhagen, Singapore, and Tokyo, and many other cities. These initiatives include the promotion of renewable energy, spread of energy-efficient housing, improvement in public transport, urban greening, the efficient use of water resources, the introduction of renewable energy technologies, and emission trading. This time, we will also discuss such initiatives at the city level. Today, we are honored to have Professor Jim Skea, Chair of the IPCC, deliver the keynote speech. The session will be moderated by Professor Kanako Morita, who has been actively involved in the IPCC and IPBES. After Professor Jim Skea's presentation, there will be a Q&A session with questions from young scientists. The keynote session will be followed by a session on industry and land use. We hope you'll enjoy this session too. Tomorrow's keynote speaker will be Mr. Alexandre Florentin. Mr. Florentin is the president of the 50-degree Paris project. This project examines the adaptation measures needed if the city of Paris were to reach 50 degrees centigrade by 2050. Now that a certain degree of temperature rise is inevitable, adaptation has also been an important issue. So far, we focused on mainly the mitigation, but this time we are also discussing adaptation. After the keynote speech, there will be a session on cities, followed by a panel discussion on integrating local policy and action. Many countries have declared net zero to meet the 1.5 degree, but this time we'll also focus on local policy and action, including action from industry and citizens. We'll be taking questions, so we look forward to your active participation. I hope the discussion during the two-day annual meeting will be useful in your activities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kainuma-sensei, for your remarks. Now we move to a keynote presentation by Professor Jim Skea, a chair of IPCC. Before the presentation, we would like to invite Dr. Kanako Morita, an associate professor of Keio University, as a chair to join us here. So, Dr. Morita, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ishikawa-san, for a kind introduction. I'm Kanako Morita, Associate Professor at Keio University in Japan, and I'll be moderating this session today. So I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Jim Skea, the Chair of Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. Last year, Professor Jim Skea was elected IPCC Chair for the 7th assessment cycle. In the previous 6th assessment cycle, he was co-chair of IPCC Working Group 3, which was focusing on climate change mitigation. And Jim was also a part of the scientific leadership for the IPCC Special Report on Global Warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. Jim was a professor of sustainable energy at Imperial College London. Professor Jim Skea will give us a keynote presentation on how can we accelerate actions to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So I will hand over to you, Jim.
Okay, thank you very much, Kanako, Tomoko, and Mikiko. And just to say, it's nice to see you again so soon, Kanako, after last week's scoping meeting in Kuala Lumpur. So let me share my screen. Make sure it's working okay. I think that should be okay now.
And can you make it slideshow mode?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Okay, so can I just start by saying on the question that's been posed and just say that unfortunately it is likely that we will exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius warming within the next decade or so. We were at 1.3 degrees roughly this year, according to the World Meteorological Organization. But just say staying below 1.5 degrees C is different from limiting warming to 1.5 degrees in the longer term. These are two separate questions. So let me come on to that later in the presentation. Now, the last reports of IPCC in the sixth cycle ran to 10,000 pages and weighed 30 kilograms. And it is difficult to summarize these in a very short period. But something that I have taken to doing is to take a look at the three goals of the Paris Agreement, the long-term temperature goal, the one on adaptation and resilience, and third on financial flows, and actually set out what the evidence is from the last IPCC cycle as to where we are with respect to each of these goals. And what I would say is these are interlocking goals. We can't prioritize one over the other. We will not get progress on any one of them unless we get progress on all of them. And of course, this all has to be done in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty. So let me spend the time I've got going through these three goals and seeing what evidence we have. And I will spend more time on the long-term temperature goal and the 1.5 degrees. So let's kick off with adaptation and resilience. I'll do that quickly because I know it's not strictly the topic of this talk. But these are the classic burning embers diagrams used by IPCC, warming above pre-industrial levels on the vertical axis, and the intensity of the colors represent the degree of risk in these different systems. So purple is a very high risk, red high, yellow moderate, and white means the risks are undetectable at these warming levels. Now, just to say to a sense of calibration, very high risks means they impact a huge number of ecosystems, a huge number of people, and the risks may be irreversible in character. So if we look on the right-hand side of the figure on ocean and coastal ecosystems, if you look at warm water corals, we are already in the transition zone from high to very high risks. And you can see that if warming gets to 2 degrees, there would be an almost complete decline of warm water corals. Even if we limit warming to 1.5 degrees, the coral reefs might decline by, say, 3/4. So this is an area where we are really in the zone already. Climate change impacts are not for the future, they're actually happening now. If we move to the left-hand side and look at land-based systems, we can see between 1 and 1.5 degrees, we are in a transition zone from moderate to high risks. Remember, we are at 1.3 degrees now, according to WMO. Last IPCC report said 1.1 degrees in the decade up to 2020. So in terms of things like wildfire damage, permafrost degradation, biodiversity loss, high risks are imminent with the way that the world is warming at the moment. And I was very keen to get that just to remind ourselves why we care about 1.5 degrees. It is an important level beyond which risks really start to accelerate. I think an optimistic message that came out of the last report is that adaptation and the way we develop our society, so very relevant for the Low Carbon Society Research Network, affect the level of risks to which we're exposed. So on the left-hand side, for heat-related morbidity and mortality, the combination of hot, humid days, which are really of risks to health, adaptation measures can reduce the risk levels and keep risks down to moderate levels if proactive adaptation is exercised up to about 2 degrees warming. On the right-hand side, looking at food insecurity, in other words, availability, access to food, again, the kind of socioeconomic development we follow can affect the degree of risks. And once again, we can keep the risks to moderate levels at around 1.5 to 2 degrees warming, depending on the way that our societies develop. So I think, as the introductory remarks from the Ministry of the Environment made, adaptation is becoming increasingly important in this IPCC cycle, and we need to pay it attention. I'm pleased to see that LCS-RNet is doing that. Now, turning more to the long-term temperature goal, looking at current status and trends. I think this was said verbally in Makiko's introduction. We are clearly not on a pathway to limiting warming to 1.5 degrees at the moment. This diagram is global greenhouse gas emissions out to 2050. This is from our last report. The pink-orange band at the top shows where we would be going with currently implemented policies, which is a small increase in emissions in most scenarios. Whereas we'd need to get on into that blue pathway if we were to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, a 43% reduction with respect to 2019 levels. And let's just recall that emissions have continued to increase since that time. The green slice shows limiting warming to 2 degrees, and the purple one with the bend in it shows where we would get to if we implemented the current set of nationally determined contributions and then moved on to a pathway that limited warming to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees with a high overshoot. So a very clear message that we're not where we need to be. And there are two gaps. There's an emissions gap, because the nationally determined contributions are not sufficient to achieve the long-term temperature goal. And there's an implementation gap, because currently implemented policies are not enough at a global level to achieve the nationally determined contributions. Now, this doesn't come from IPCC. It comes from the UNEP emissions gap report that came out fairly recently. And there we have the projections for what would happen first if current policies continue. We have a 67% chance of limiting warming to 3 degrees, which is a fairly disastrous picture in terms of impacts. The unconditional NDCs would get that down to 2.8 degrees warming. And if we took then the conditional NDCs, those that are conditional, for example, on enhanced financial flows, that would take it down to 2.6. And it's only if you take all of the conditional and nationally determined contributions and all of the net zero pledges that have been made, would you bring emission pathways in line with the long-term temperature goal. That is limiting warming to well below 2 degrees, pursuing efforts towards 1.5. So even that one at the bottom, it does not get us to 1.5 degrees, but it puts us within the bracket for the long-term temperature goal as expressed in the Paris Agreement. Now, just a couple of other background things. One is on global equity issues and the distribution of emissions around the world. And the left-hand panel shows cumulative carbon dioxide emissions by region since 1850, since the pre-industrial era. And the right-hand side has a snapshot of total greenhouse gas emissions per capita by the same set of regions. And a very clear set of messages that are being picked up by many countries. And I noticed that this diagram was referenced extensively in many country submissions to the International Court of Justice, which is currently working on its advisory opinion on the obligation of states in relation to climate change. So if we look at the left-hand side, between them, North America and Europe, responsible for about 40% of historic carbon dioxide emissions, with very low numbers at the right-hand side, for example, for Southern Asia and Africa. And just to note, the solid green part refers to fossil fuel carbon emissions. The grey part refers to those from land use change and forestry. So just looking at the energy part of it, Southeast Asia and the Pacific, Africa, extremely low in terms of emissions. And a number that appeared in the text really revealed the very low contribution made by the small island developing states and the least developed countries to historic emissions. Right-hand side shows per capita emissions, just a snapshot for the present day. North America, clearly the highest, almost 20 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per capita, going right down to about 2 to 3 tons per capita in Africa and Southern Asia. And just to flag, we have the strange region, the Pacific developed countries, Australia, Japan, and New Zealand, which is the second highest per capita emissions at about 12.5, roughly the same as Eastern Europe, West Central Asia, and the Middle East. So a huge variety. And these kind of numbers in this view, I think, has been quite important in terms of the negotiations. I think before we leave the current picture, just of course the good news story, renewable electricity generation, the cost has fallen very considerably over the last decade or so. The declines are about 80% from solar photovoltaics on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, lithium-ion battery parks have fallen in cost by a similar amount. And there have been very substantial, but perhaps less in total magnitude declines in the cost of onshore wind and offshore wind. And these declines in cost have been associated with a big increase in market adoption, which you can see at the bottom. Wind and solar together are now about 10% of global electricity generation, almost unimaginable 10 to 15 years ago. And one thing I would like to flag is let's not forget that investment in these technologies did not start recently. We have been carrying out R&D into these technologies since the late 1970s, effectively, and it has taken that time to make the progress that has allowed these technologies to get to significant market penetration. One thing that we should say about renewable electricity, it is the adoption is focused in 3 parts of the world, in China, in North America, and Europe. And the big challenge is to spread that deployment to other parts of the world, with attention to issues like grid access and the high cost of capital faced by many least developed countries. So in terms of the long-term temperature goal itself, these are the emission pathways out across the 21st century that are compatible with 1.5 degrees warming on the left-hand side and 2 degrees on the right-hand side. So very clearly, carbon dioxide emissions must meet the fabled net zero by mid-century, around 2050. There needs to be declines in emissions of other greenhouse gases, such as methane, which is shown there. And of course, following that, greenhouse gas emissions will also fall. But in the scenarios IPCC assessed, these in fact do not reach net zero in the middle of the range until the 2090s. On the right-hand side, of course, at 2 degrees warming, the time of net zero CO2 is postponed by about a decade. And in fact, in the middle of the range of scenarios, greenhouse gas emissions do not reach net zero during the 21st century, though they do in some of the scenarios. So that's where we would need to be a very clear picture. Now, one of the things that we did in the last report was to look at the near-term potential for various technologies and approaches to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And just to say this, by near term, we mean up to 2030. So it really is very near term. And these are the potentials that we identified. And just to flag, to give a calibration, total greenhouse gas emissions currently about 57 gigatons per year carbon dioxide equivalent. So for the largest ones, we're looking a bit under 10% of total emissions reduction potential. So on the energy side, the biggest potential is quite clearly from the technologies I've mentioned already, wind energy and solar energy. But with also, I think, a big potential, if you look further down for energy, reducing methane emissions from fossil fuel systems also has a significant potential. And just let me flag to you that the colours reflect the cost of the individual reductions. So to flag, the blue part of it is that costs have to be low, are actually lower than the reference level. In fact, it would pay to take up these technologies even if climate change were not happening. Looking at AFLU at the bottom, significant potential for carbon sequestration in agriculture, for example, from soil management, reduced conversion of forests and other systems, avoided deforestation, and ecosystem restoration, afforestation, and reforestation. So very significant potentials there. Since I see your next session is on industry, I thought I would put up the industry figures there as well. And just to flag a significant potential in the near term from fuel switching, effectively electrification, moving to lower carbon forms of fossil fuels like natural gas, bioenergy, or hydrogen, all have short-term potential. Now, I should say that because this is near-term potential, it is not capturing the potential for major process change. For example, electrification of steel production, various techniques to change cement production, which I think have a bigger potential in the longer term. Another thing that we did in the last report was to flag up the real importance of demand-side emission reduction potential. I won't go through it all, but what the authors did was to ask themselves how much greenhouse gas emissions you need to meet human needs for shelter, mobility, and nutrition. And basically, needs by 2050 could be met even if greenhouse gas emissions were reduced by between 40 to 70% in different sectors. And important to mention, though this is a demand side, it's not all about individual choice, which is the blue bars labeled socio-cultural factors. It also needs the provision of infrastructure, the provision of technologies to allow people to make the relevant changes. So, perfect example, electric vehicles, for example, people need to choose to buy the vehicles, but we need charging infrastructure and we need manufacturers to offer attractive technologies, but a big demand side potential. And one of the final slide on the long-term temperature goal, to focus that in the last report, we paid increasing attention to carbon dioxide removal techniques, which vary in terms of the removal process. Is it biological? Is it geochemical? Is it chemical? It varies according to the storage mechanism or formation. Is it geological? Is it in minerals? Is it in vegetation? Or is it in final products, for example, in building construction? And they also vary in terms of the time scale of storage. Some of the biological approaches could only last for decades, whereas some of the geological approaches, we could sequester the carbon for centuries or even millennia. So this is something that's getting increasing attention from IPCC. And just to flag, it's not just the physical approaches. We have the policy mechanisms and tools to make it happen. We already identified that gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions have been avoided by policies applied already. Climate legislation covers more than half of global emissions, a fifth of emissions covered by carbon pricing. But carbon pricing isn't the only tool in the box. We can also use, and may be more appropriate, to use things like regulations, standards, sunset requirements on technologies, information advice, and of course, skills training and supply chain development to move things forward. So let me just say, this is the third Paris goal, the question of consistent financial flows. And here the picture is not good. What the people in our investment and finance chapter did in the last cycle was to compare current annual yearly flows, investment flows for various technologies, types of economy and region, which is the blue bars on the left-hand side, and compare that with the investment needs by the end of this decade if we were to put ourselves onto Paris compliant pathways. And the simple picture is we are not investing enough at the moment. Investment flows would need to go up by between a factor of 3 to 6. The gap is least for energy supply, particularly electricity. We're beginning to make progress on renewables, but the gaps are bigger for energy efficiency, transport, and even bigger for agriculture, forestry, and other land use. So again, a bit of a depressing picture. And of course, this was a topic of major discussion at the COP in Baku. Now, if I can finish, because I'm deliberately not going to try to overrun, Kanako. I will try to finish off just very briefly on IPCC's plans for the 7th cycle, which is a very current issue. So there's work already underway. The outline of a special report on climate change in cities has been agreed, and author selection is in the final stages, and we're expecting that report to come out in early 2027. The task force on national greenhouse gas emission inventories, which is, of course, based at IGES in Japan, has got the task of producing 2 methodology reports which provide guidance to governments on how to report their emissions to the Framework Convention. There's a methodology report on short-lived climate forcers, things like SO2, NOx, volatile organic compounds. The outline of that has been agreed, and author selection again is in the final stages, and that should be approved by late 2027. And finally, the scoping meeting for a report on carbon dioxide removal technologies and carbon capture utilization storage, to which I just dedicated a slide. The scoping meeting has been held, and the panel is set to agree the outline at the end of February next year. And again, it's due to be approved in late 2027. The working group reports. The panel has agreed that we will have the 3 normal working group reports: physical science, impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability, and mitigation during this cycle, and they will be produced in this order. The one thing that they have not agreed on is the timetable for producing these reports. The scoping meeting, I think, as was said in the introduction, has just been held in Kuala Lumpur last week. Kanako was there. I remember well, sitting in breakout groups with her. And the report has resulted in draft outlines for the 3 working group reports. And these will be considered at the next plenary session of IPCC in Hangzhou in China at the end of February. And we hope that this will result in agreement on the outlines and also agreement on a schedule for producing the reports, which the question of alignment or not with the second global stocktake under Paris is the key issue. I want to also flag just 2 other things. Working Group 2 on impacts, adaptation, vulnerability is tasked with producing a distinct product, revising and updating the technical guidelines on the assessment of impacts and adaptation, with an emphasis on adaptation indicators, metrics, and methods. And this distinct product was also scoped in Kuala Lumpur and is scheduled to be approved by governments at the end of February. And very finally, looking far into the future, there is a synthesis report for the 7th cycle, which is my personal responsibility. I cannot get out of that. And it is scheduled that this will be produced by late 2029, after the completion of the working group reports. And I hope, Kanako, I haven't overrun too much. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jim, for your keynote presentation, and thank you for explaining about the key important message from the 6th assessment report, as well as also the schedule of the 7th assessment cycle. And also thank you for explaining the need to accelerate the climate change actions, and also showing that there are various options and also tools to achieve the climate change goals. So I can see many audience joining this session today. So I would like to invite questions and comments from the audience, and I have already received several questions. And first, I would like to invite Osamu Nishiura. Are you there? Yes. So yeah, so over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for your great presentation, and also thank you very much for the opportunity to ask a question. And I have a question about decarbonization in developing countries. I use a global scale integrated assessment model to estimate the economic impact of implementing NDCs and net zero pledges. In doing these estimates, I found that even though developed countries set more stringent reduction targets than developing countries, in many cases, developing countries could suffer greater economic losses than developed countries. And from an economic perspective and historical emissions, developed countries may need to pursue further efforts, but much of the emission reduction potential remains in developing countries. Under this situation, what kind of technologies or systems or support from developed countries will be the key to helping developing countries meet their current targets and set more stringent targets? Could you share your thoughts about this, Yosuke?
Yeah, will I take these one at a time, Kanako? Yeah.
Or can I take like 3 questions?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So next is Moritz Sebald. Is it?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
all right.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the excellent presentation. And my question is, some people argue that achieving the 1.5-degree goal is unattainable with the current economic system based on growth mostly. How does the IPCC address this debate in its assessments? Thank you.
Thank you, Moritz. And next is Augustine Danox. Is it? I'm not sure whether.
Hi.
So yeah, Augustine. Yes.
Thank you very much for the presentation and the opportunity to ask a question. My question regards the fact that the world seems increasingly fragmented, yet looking at the very narrow lens of scenarios in the past AR6 report, it seems that SSP2 has been very predominant, and that this question of increasing conflict, whether trade conflicts or military conflicts, might be a blind spot for part of the scientific community. So how should the science reflect those changes, and how should we adapt how we communicate to policymakers in that context? Thank you.
Thank you. So Jim, can you answer to these two?
Yeah, sure. And on the first one, it's really why I emphasize that the 3 goals of the Paris Agreement are interlocking, and you can't make progress on one without making progress on all of them. Because quite plainly, some of the least cost opportunities for greenhouse gas emission reduction are in developing countries, but the financial capacity rise in the developed world. So I think that the question of the way that financial flows can be directed towards developing countries is absolutely critical, in the overall picture. And obviously some of that might come by direct almost grant aid to developing countries, especially for issues like grid infrastructure, your infrastructural development. But it's also important that we leverage private financial flows from developed countries to developing countries as well, which can be, through for things like concessional finance by the public sector that can help to leverage private funds. So the fact that a measure takes place in a developing country doesn't necessarily mean it's paid for in a developing country. And I think that is an absolutely critical point. And I will continue to emphasize the interlocking nature of the Paris goals. You can't get the long-term temperature goal unless you also make progress on the third goal on finance. On the question of low growth scenarios, there was a question about the different economic models. I've heard lots of arguments about how the current economic growth model does not work. I haven't seen any modeling exercises and would really put out that challenge. If there are other economic models that can allow us to have more success, let's see them modeled and let's see the picture, because what I mainly see at the moment is the criticism, the negative comments about the existing economic growth model. I would really like to see modeling and scenarios that explore different ways of development, if that is possible. So that's kind of a challenge to the community as well. It's not just a case of criticizing what we've got already. We've got to have alternatives out there to present to policymakers. And finally, on this question of the way the scenarios and modeling communities very much focused on shared socioeconomic pathway 2 in the last cycle, it is somewhat to my regret that a more diverse set of socioeconomic backgrounds were not explored by the community. And I think particular more attention to SSP1, the Sustainable Development one, would have helped. And I personally would like to see the community addressing more substantially issues around equity in terms of growth, which was kind of picked up in implied in the first question as well. I think there are fundamental challenges in public sector bodies hypothesizing scenarios like that involve, say, military conflict as well. We need to get our reports approved by countries. And I think the best we can do is produce a range of scenarios with a range of economic growth assumptions that really explore the range in which we might go. I don't think it's much more difficult for research communities to hypothesize, individual incidents or flashpoints, which would be each of which may have a low probability and are very hard to predict. But I take the point entirely, and we're living in a more fragmented world, and I think that fact could be captured in a more generic way, perhaps, in some of the scenarios that are explored by the community.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. So I also receiving a question from the researcher who has a background in law. And I think if she can speak, ask question directly, I want to invite her. Ichihara-san, can you ask question? If not, I'm reading her question. So one of the measures that citizens are taking to help achieving a climate goal is taking a legal action like litigation. And the number of cases is increasingly rapidly around the world. So however, even when groundbreaking verdicts are handed down, there are still cases where the government does not necessarily implement them appropriately. And so she thinks that there is a limitation of the role that climate change litigation can play in achieving the climate change goals. So, and she wants to know that whether you have any advice and any view, like proposals that is there any possible roles that research in the field of law can play in overcoming these limitations? Oh, Ichihara-san, sorry. You can also add something more.
Thank you so much. I hope that some person have me upgraded to the panelist. Thank you so much. I cannot speak.
Sorry.
Thank you for introducing my question. Yeah, I admit my interest is very not niche place. So, but as a legal researchers, I'm very keen to know what kind of role we can do in terms of the under 1 point degrees social society. Thank you.
Jim, do you have any
Yeah. Okay. I mean, we had chapters on policies and institutions and international cooperation in the last cycle, which did assess the literature on climate litigation and what progress can actually be made. And one thing I would flag, of course, the International Court of Justice has been invited by the General Assembly of the UN by consensus to deliver an advisory opinion on the obligations of states in respect of climate change. And that is something, I mean, it is an advisory opinion, and the word advisory is very relevant. But whatever the court comes out with could have an influence on the kind of litigation that takes place at national levels as well. One thing I would caution on, having had interactions with judges in the not too distant future, judges themselves don't necessarily want to hear the opinions of legal scholars about what their duties are. they may want to make up their own opinion about it. And my expectation is that what judges, for example, may be interested in is much more is the evidence, the physical aspects of the evidence about climate change. For example, the attribution of impacts to emissions, these kinds of issues, because frankly, they have a lot of difficult issues to consider given the collective nature of the climate change problem. Many people have contributed to the emissions. So how do you allocate or attribute individual responsibility? I think there are many difficult legal issues there. And all we can do as scholars and academics is to continue and write. The judges may pay attention to it or they may not, but they will certainly have an interest in the physical aspects of climate change.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a very important part. So we need to hear more about the scientific aspect, physical aspect. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Masako-san.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I still have several questions. So can I share you a question, and then if you find you can answer the question, then so one is questions written in this Zoom Q&A. So it's about the EV sector. It's globally seen as a key driver of decarbonization, but recent EVs market crisis have raised concern about its growth. Given the critical roles of the EVs in achieving the 1.5 degree target, how can climate policy address the current crisis in the sector while ensuring a fair and inclusive transition for consumers and workers? And another question is a little bit broad. How mitigation and adaptation could be combined in a way synergies are maximized and trade-offs are minimized. And then the last question is how to control international carbon leakage and relocation associated with the decarbonization in difficult to address sectors. How does the EU CBAM, the CBAM work effectively? How can we apply CBAM globally without violating World Trade Organization rules? Is there other measures? So yeah, I'm receiving a lot of questions, but if you find you can.
Yeah, sure. On electric vehicles, I mean, I have never seen any technology that has smoothly gone into the future. It's always gone ups and downs. But I think, for example, in my own country, about a quarter of the new vehicles sold are now electric vehicles, and the trend is undoubtedly upwards. I think the question is you need to persist it. It needs public sector attention to the question of charging infrastructure so that people can get around issues around range anxiety. In new markets, it may involve some kind of subsidy in order to get some of the higher upfront costs and allow consumers to get beyond that. So I have no doubt there will be hiccups in the growth of electric vehicles going forward, but I think the longer term trend is upward. I think the other concern is, of course, the role of critical materials and minerals in supply chains for electric vehicles. And there are quite clearly issues around the question of human rights and labor rights around the development of these supply chains. It does need attention, and I think, for example, the manufacturers would have a responsibility to ensure that along their supply chains, human rights are actually being respected. Just to say, I was chair of a Just Transition Commission in my native Scotland until I took on the IPCC chairing role. So I'm extremely conscious of the issues of just transition, not just transitioning out of the old fossil fuel economy, but transitioning into the new economy as well. On adaptation mitigation, in the last cycle, both Working Groups 2 and Working Groups 3 paid attention to synergies between adaptation and mitigation measures. And these are most obvious probably in areas like cities. For example, investment in green and blue infrastructure can have benefits in terms of both adaptation and mitigation. And also in the agriculture and land use sector, a lot of soil-based measures can actually help to adapt to the effects of climate change change while helping to absorb more carbon dioxide, for example, in soils. There isn't any generic answer to this. You need to look at the specific opportunities in specific areas. Now, the questions on CBAM and carbon border adjustments, I frankly don't know, because we didn't really I mean, these were very new things, and the closing date for our literature was in fact the end of 2021. So IPCC, and I think the literature has to pick up on that. I'm sure the UK is not a member of the European Union, so I don't need to speak for it either as IPCC chair or in my individual capacity. But I'm sure the EU would actually argue that the CBAM mechanism from the European Union is actually compatible with WTO rules, and I'm quite sure that other people might disagree with them. That is something for the legal scholars to pick up on a previous question, I think, to explore, and I'm sure we will have to cover it much more in the 7th assessment cycle as part of the next report.
Yes, thank you. I received last question. Can I pick from the Q&As? So this will be the really last question. How can we fix policy issues at the governance level for easy implementation of climate-related action items? How can we explore latest technology like AI in logistics or supply chain management? Do you have?
Right. Okay. First of all, if I can quarrel with the question a little, there is no easy implementation. Implementation is difficult, and there's no point in underestimating the challenges of having putting in place policies that do change. There are winners and losers from policies. We need to face up to that and take it forward. And I think that's the challenge of a just transition. It's not a magic phrase that makes everything easy. It's a way of identifying what the challenges are and making sure that there are considerations of equity. The question about AI and the rest of it, I'm sorry, that's just too detailed. I do not know the answer to that. No doubt we will cover it in the next cycle.
Yeah. Thank you, Jim. Thank you very much for explaining a lot of things in such a short time. And we finally arrive at the end of our session. So I would like to thank Professor Jim Skea again for giving a great talk. And I think this discussion will also help stimulate the discussion in the following sessions. So thank you so much. Thank you, Jim.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Jim, and then the Kanako-san for the very nice keynote session. So here we will have the short break, and we'd like to resume today's first thematic session on industrial sector decarbonization at 10:05 in UK time and 11:05 in Central Europe, and then the 7:05 in Japan. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon to everybody in Japan. Good morning to everybody in Europe. I'm very happy to chair this year's session on accelerate industrial sector transition of the Low Carbon Society ResearchNet annual meeting. And we already had heard briefly about the relevance of the I have to check something. The relevance of the industrial sector for international decarbonization. And I'm very happy to have to be able to announce 3 excellent speakers today. First, we will hear from Frank Peter from Agora Industry from Germany on heavy industries from hard to abate to frontrunner. Second will be Isadora Wang from Agora China. So we will hear about Chinese heavy industry, about the prospects of decarbonization there. I think a very important topic. And then we have Imogen Rattle from the UK, from University of Leeds, which will give us an impression on the local perspective on the industrial transition. So I'm really happy about that. After the 3 presentations, we will have a discussion together with the speakers and Rahul Pandey from India and Kentaro Tamura from IGIS Japan. So at least in Europe and Asia, we will have a broad coverage of the regions, and I'm very happy about that, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. I think industrial sector is very important. Almost 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions are linked directly or indirectly to industry, and particularly to a small number of heavy industries, which are often termed as hard to decarbonize. However, we see some encouraging developments which might be help us to be much faster in these sectors. We see encouraging policies in Europe, in China, in other world regions to accelerate industrial decarbonization. But on the other hand, as already heard, there's also a trend to fragmentation globally, which may also place strong barriers. So I'm really excited to hear from you what you think about the prospects of acceleration in accelerating industrial decarbonization. Please, Frank, are you able to share your slides?
I am. We tested it and it should work. So, can you see my slides already? And now also
Yes.
in presentation mode?
I
Hopefully.
think yes, now it's
There
here.
we are. Thanks a lot, Stefan. Thanks a lot for this invitation. I must say I'm quite excited. It's the first time to speak exactly in the slot after Jim Skea, but I must say also it's quite shoes to fill. So let's give it a try. Who am I? I'm Frank. I work for a group of think tanks that is based in Germany. We are about 100 experts working on, well, what Jim basically phrased as the challenging part, the implementation questions. We're working exactly on the link between policy making, science, industry, civil society organizations. We have offices in Brussels, Berlin, Bangkok, Beijing, and we operate currently a team of 30 experts dedicatedly looking into industry. And well, we are a rather young organization, so we were just founded in 2020, and Stefan has, with his research, of course, quite a lot paralleled our developments. So how do we work? We are basically very much embedded also in the ecosystem of industrial players. So we are really trying also to get our foot on the ground, to understand where the barriers are of implementing innovative technologies on the ground. But we usually also start from science. So sound analytical basis is the fundament of our work as well. And well, that's how we see ourselves. And we have also published quite a few reports over the past, let's say, 5 years on the industry decarbonization. Let's start into it. Stefan already mentioned it. Why does industry matter? Well, they represent almost 40% of global carbon emissions. And basically, 5 sectors are responsible for more than 50% of the share of the industrial emissions. It's steel, cement, chemicals, pulp and paper, aluminum. And as Stefan already mentioned, these sectors were in the past called hard to abate. And I must say, in the policy arena, this has been one of the biggest excuses of the past decade why industry wouldn't be in the position to act fast and to go ahead in the transition. But already on the next slide, you can see why this is a problem. Because the central assets of the heavy industries in particular have pretty long lifetimes. And already investments today basically define our future pathways on climate neutrality. And that's why investments in steel, cement, chemicals in Europe, Japan, China, or even India with a climate neutrality target by 2070 must think already about this investment cycle. What is done today matters with the lifetimes of steelworks, steam crackers, and cement kilns for decades. And this is why we need to pay much more attention also politically on the industry topic. And we have really worked on this quite hard over the past 5 years to make this happen. Because what is also true is that a lot of the existing assets globally are reaching the reinvestment points. So in particular in the industrialized world, about 50% of blast furnaces will reach relining dates, critical relining dates, so investment dates, reinvestment dates in the next 10 years, where an opportunity for change is given. And given also the importance of the climate challenge that we have, we cannot lose on these investment points and these opportunities. What are the key strategies of the industry climate neutrality? And Stefan, you know this slide very well because it's out of our first industry publication that we have developed in 2019, 2020. And I must say on the key strategies, little has changed over the course of the last years. It's about direct and indirect use of renewable electricity as one of the core strategies. The second one is resource and energy efficiency. So avoid the use of polluting, in particular, virgin heavy industry materials. And thirdly, it's about closing the carbon cycle. So carbon capture storage technologies, but also the use of sustainable biomass play a huge role in getting us to climate neutrality in the industrial sector. And what's even more important, most of these technologies that already have the opportunity to get us really close to net zero are available by today. Here's the example of the steel sector, where we have, for example, a DRI technology based on hydrogen available today, which can already bring us quite a fair share down in the emissions trajectory of the steel sector. And given the importance of the steel sector globally, to deploy these technologies now at large scale in the next investment cycle is a key challenge and is the key also opportunity to implement fast-tracking action. And what also in these technologies come through already is we have with the industry, because they use carbon quite a lot still in the processes or even integrated in the longevity of the products, the opportunity potentially to store carbon in the long run out of the atmosphere again in product cycles. And I think Jim already outlined that we most likely will have a threat to stay below 1.5 degree, but we in the end want to come back to 1.5 degree and limit global warming in the long-term perspective to 1.5, where technical things may play a crucial role in the future to get to this. And in particular, heavy industries, the sectors like steel, cement, and chemicals are in the position to deliver also on that angle of the future, and the technology options are very well established and understood how to achieve this. I have brought you here an example of the steel sector, how we think and quite quick acceleration of the technology deployment of the low carbon technologies is possible to drastically reduce the emissions from the sector and to even reach climate neutrality in the sector already in the 2040s. This is just one example of the heavy polluting sectors. Different or such similar scenarios are possible also for the cement and for the chemical sector, but one must clearly say that here we are still not that far advanced in aligning the future strategies. There's more way to go, but also here we are strongly expecting that the change is possible to stay on the pathway of 1.5 degree. And just to put the attention here a bit also on this scenario, the steel sector as well is one of the sectors that can deliver on the technical things to remove carbon out of the atmosphere. We need carbon for the metallurgical processes of the steel sector. And if this is deployed by sustainable carbon in the future, and then the equipment is equipped with carbon capture and storage technology, we have here the opportunity to save, first of all, massive emissions compared to a business as usual scenario. And secondly, also provide the much needed negative emissions of the future. So, and one thing, how this all looks then together here as an example from just a recent modeling work that we have done on Germany. What are the key pillars until 2030? And Jim already outlined this a bit. Well, electrification of processes is a key element. The deployment of DRI steel technology, another one. Then the cement sector plays a huge role to start with efficiency and also circularity measures. Plus the first deployment of CCS technologies gives us already quite an opportunity by 2030 to advance and really jump into the key technologies that are available. And in the longer term perspective, it's really then the scaling and the rollout of these technologies and the delivery of negative emission that brings us in the situation that industry can really contribute to a low carbon future and play this key role. So these are technology perspectives, but how to implement it? And we have, for us, found out in the policy arena that we basically need 4 key pillars of the transformation, the policies that need to be developed. First of all, upstream, we call this, we need to have the industry be ready to be supplied with green electricity, green hydrogen, and have access to critical carbon management infrastructure. So developing these infrastructure is a high priority to really fast track the deployment of low carbon technologies. And this is where policy needs to make its homework to enable the frameworks to secure also the financial situation of this critical infrastructure ramp up. Secondly, we have to address midstream the change of the production technologies itself. Of course, carbon pricing policies help here a lot, but we see in particular OPEX becoming a critical, let's say, de-risking policy for low carbon industry technologies, because we see that not the investment is really the problem, but the higher operational costs of low carbon technologies of the future. So OPEX support schemes like carbon contracts for difference, for example, or even tax credits, maybe like it's done in the US, are critical support scheme for this midstream element to overturn and really fundamentally change the processes how we produce our polluting heavy industry goods. And downstream, and this is, I must say, one of the most overlooked things and the ones where we have the biggest delays also in the European policy framework, but also in the US, is the element of green market creation. We must make sure that the green materials become the standard product of the future. And lead market developments by public procurement instruments, by embodied carbon regulation, by standards and labels for customers to give them the opportunity to choose between a low carbon and a more carbon intensive product are key elements that we need to double down in the next policy cycles where is it possible to advance the ramp up of markets for green materials. Last but not least, the fourth key pillar is an international framework with regard, of course, to the nexus of climate and trade. We have heard already the talks about the EU CBAM system, but also international cooperation frameworks are, from our perspective, very much required in order to stimulate potentially trade of green intermediate products like green iron, ammonia, green methanol. All these elements, from our perspective, are, from a policy perspective, crucial to fast deploy those technologies internationally. That's it for my input, Stefan, and I'm happy to stay also for the discussion. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Frank, for this good overview and what we need to do. Maybe one quick remark that's really great. I think we have the knowledge what to do in this field. But recently we saw industry dragging their feet from some announced projects in Europe and governments also slowing down. So maybe one quick word, how do you see the current situation and the prospects of that becoming implemented on a broad scale?
So in particular, the questions of bringing together how this transition can potentially help also industry companies to stay competitive is one of the key elements that need to be resolved at the same time. Plus, combining this with social just transition measures, because also structural change in the industry is about to happen. These are the key elements that need to be brought together. What makes me a bit positive is that most of the industrial players have understood that just competing on the conventional old business models is no really escape for future, for example, competitiveness challenges. So most of them are really advancing the game and say, okay, let's build a framework for the new economy, for the new industrial processes, and then let's try to establish our competitive advantage on this end of the equation. It's pretty clear with Europe taking action also to with its CBAM scheme that for this critical market access to Europe, it's quite clear that with green product market access in Europe will be easier. We also see same discussions and developments in the US to talk about a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So it's most likely also about that these kind of measures may create spillovers in other regions of the world, because it's very well understood that green products may trade easier in the future on global markets. And this is where I think we still, given the complexity, we see some positive signs that things are going forward. Well, this is where I think we must double down also in the policy arena to build the confidence that this change is possible and adjust the regulatory framework in a way that these new business models can succeed.
Okay, yes, thank you for these good outlooks and overview over the current situation. And I think with these words, we will now turn from a more European perspective to an Asian perspective and going to China, which is, of course, the biggest industrial producer by far in the world in these days. And so very important and also very relevant. And I'm really very happy to welcome Isadora Wang from Agora China, who will give us some insights on the Chinese situation, what is China doing, and how we can go ahead there. Welcome, Isadora. I hope you can share your slides with us.
Thank you, Stefan. I think Frank is still sharing his slides, or if the moderator could help share. Okay, I'll do it from my side. Thank you very much for inviting me, having me here. As Frank has mentioned, Agora, we have offices in Berlin, Brussels, Bangkok, and Beijing. I am based in Beijing and responsible for our research work in China, especially those industry decarbonization policy, advocacy, and research work. I would like to dive into the status quo here in China about heavy industry decarbonization right after the broad introduction by Frank. Actually, for those who are not familiar with the Chinese policy framework, China has already released its target to peak carbon emissions by 2030, like nationwide, and reach carbon neutrality by 2060. To give you some examples, the steel and cement sectors in China have already peaked their emissions by peaking their production volume. And as you can see, the policy drive for China to decarbonize its industry sectors is a little bit segmented and put into several different policies scattered around different ministries. For example, China has announced to cover steel, cement, and aluminum production in its national carbon trading scheme by the end of this year. China's carbon trading scheme, ETS, is established in 2021 following the EU ETS example. And right now, it only covers the power generation sector with free allocation given to the sector companies. For the first 2 years, 2025 and 2026, the Chinese government will also allocate free allocations for the industry sectors, just for them to get familiar with carbon accounting and also trading in the system. Starting from 2027, there will be carbon prices and cost burdens for those companies. But within the design, the detailed design of covering those sectors into the Chinese national ETS, you can see that the government and also the industry sector players are facing rivalries from each other. For example, at the beginning, when there was a consultation from the government about the implementation details, every process of cement production is covered into the boundary. But at the end, like when we released the final document, only clinker combustion is included, like which is kind of a shrinked boundary from a negotiation, like strong fight back from the cement companies. Also, with the new legislation of China's energy law in November this year, China started to emphasize the use and the promotion of renewable hydrogen value chain and to replace fossil fuel use in steel, oil refining, and coal chemical manufacturing sectors. This means in the future, the infrastructure of renewable hydrogen will be easier to be designed and to be built all over the country. And also on-site production of renewable hydrogen from renewable electricities for refilling use will be much easier than before. And also, for those who are not familiar with the production volume in China, China produces more than half of the world's steel output and cement output. So this leads to the significance that China has suspended the approval of new steel production capacity this year, also flagging that the Chinese government has been very serious about its industrial decarbonization plans and steps. The other aspect to promote industrial decarbonization is, of course, counting on the circular economy. For example, the circulation of scrap steel, plastics. To promote these, China has established very different policies and also moves from different perspectives. For example, the government founded this state-owned enterprise called China Resources Circulation Group in October, which is very fast, just 1 month after the announcement of the plan. And the business portfolio will focus on scrap, steel, ferrous metal circulation, also plastics, retired batteries, and wind and solar equipment. Also, China has also released several 300 billion Chinese yuan national debts to boost the renewal of large-scale equipment and also consumer goods. For example, white appliances, commercial ships, and cars to boost the scrap steel output in the country. And China's Iron and Steel Association is also to establish its sub-association for electric arc furnaces development. Right now, EF production only account for less than 10% of the total steel output in China. So there is a big room to promote it. As I've just briefly mentioned, hydrogen production and hydrogen value chain is key for the decarbonization in China's steel sector and also chemical sector in the future. Because even with circular economy and scrap steel supply, there will be a big proportion, maybe more than a half of the steel production will still be primary steel making. Then to reduce the use of coke will be crucial for the sector to decarbonize. That is why hydrogen development policies is so important. In the past 8 years, the Chinese government has actually successfully fostered this production from byproduct, for example, coke oven gases, for the fuel cell electric vehicle sector to use and to apply renewable hydrogen. For example, if you can see on the photo on the upside, it's a FCEV to help transport all the steel products and also steel materials. I would say like the top 20 steel companies, steel producers in China are already adopted dozens of this FCEV fleet for their raw material transportation. The other significance is, of course, to test out and commercialize hydrogen DRI, direct reduction ion, or other low carbon steel production technologies. For example, the second picture shows an H2DRI project running in China's southern province with 1 million ton steel output each year. we have, like in China, we have two of these kind of demonstration projects. For the other technologies of low carbon steel making, we have like different steel makers in China are testing out all those different technologies. For example, CCUS, CO2 circulation injection in blast furnaces, fluid bed H2 reduction, and also MOEs. So you can see not only from the policy side, the government perspective, that it's getting stricter and stricter for industry sectors to really decarbonize and turn to low carbon technologies. But also from the company side, they are very much aware of the global situation. For example, the implementation of the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM, to increase their international competitiveness. If we talk about the competitiveness, I would like to quote these two diagrams from the EU JRC, showing the carbon intensity of steel production in major countries compared with the EU. On the left-hand side is the integrated route, a blast furnace, a basic oxygen furnace route. You can see that from the gray dots, China's carbon intensity is not that high, which means it's still competitive if there is EU CBAM fees implemented for the Chinese steel export from China to the EU. But if it comes to secondary steel making, for example, the electric arc furnaces, you can see from the diagram on the right-hand side, China's carbon intensity is quite high. This is because of the electricity carbon intensity in China. Although many of the steel makers, the secondary steel makers in China are using hydropower in the CBAM like methodology, only the national emission factor is used. So you can't really base that on your individual cases. This is a problem and has been caught by the Chinese steel makers, and they are adopting different techniques actually to decarbonize their indirect emissions, not just to cope with the EU CBAM, but also to cope with the low carbon transition demand within the country. For example, Chinese steel companies are ranking very top in green electricity purchase in China. You can see like top 1, top 2, and many of the steel makers in China, be it state-owned or private, they are using rooftops walls like every space they have to install solar PV, and for some of them also wind power to try to decarbonize their indirect emissions. Another very important aspect for industrial decarbonization is efficiency. For this part, the government is leading several different campaigns on this. For example, we have the 3-year action plan for steel sector energy efficiency benchmark targets. The government is saying that for those who like at the end of 2025, for those companies who didn't meet the benchmark efficiency, they will be banned from production. Although there is still a question mark on whether the government will ban their production when it comes, we would promote that there is already overcapacity in steel making in China. Would be a smart and wise choice for the government to implement what they have mentioned, they have promised before. I think the time is up. And my time is up, so I'll just stop here and continue the discussion in the panel. Thank you. I'll hand back the floor to Stefan.
Yes, thank you, Isadora. Thanks a lot for these very interesting insights on the many things happening in China. That's really exciting to hear that. And maybe also one question to you. I mean, these were impressive numbers what steel industry is doing in the megatons of green or hydrogen-based steels, lots of renewable developments. But maybe can you give us briefly link that to the overall capacity of steel industry in China? How big is compared to the overall? Sorry, you have to unmute.
Yeah. Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. If you compare the H2DRI demonstration project capacity with the overall steel output capacity in China, it's neglectable, I would say. Like now we have almost 2 million tons of H2DRI, but they are based on byproduct hydrogen or like gas. Like natural gas-based hydrogen. So that's not green yet, not renewable yet. In China, the total steel production capacity is 1.3 billion tons. But each year the output is like 1 billion ton or 1.1 billion ton. And compared with billion tons, 2 million tons is like very small number. And I would like to echo what Frank has said, from the demand side, from the infrastructure side, there are a lot that need to be done to promote, the consuming of green steel. Although the Chinese government is trying to do some of the green procurement, for example, for new landscape buildings to use 100% green steel, green cement, and green glass, green building materials. But this has to be scaled up in China to help boost private investment into the transition and also to promote the awareness more in the individual and corporate consumer side.
Okay, yes, thank you. And we have seen that China was quick in ramping up in the past, so let's hope it will be also like that in the future for steel, for example. And with that, I try to hand over to the next presenter. Frank already mentioned the social and regional aspects, which are very important, and also I think that holds true as well for China with many heavy industrialized regions, but not also for China. It's an issue in the UK, and now I'm really looking forward to Imogen Rattle from University of Leeds, who will present us, so to say, more the local perspective, which all these transitions in industry also have, as industry is rather focused on localities. And Imogen, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. So yes, as Stefan says, this is a piece of research which is still in progress about what's happening in the UK locally on industrial decarbonisation. And I think it complements the other two speakers very well. So to touch them briefly, policy approaches to industrial decarbonisation take normally one of three forms. They can focus on sectors, as we've said, and the previous speakers have outlined what these heavy industry sectors are: steel, cement, chemicals, and so on. We can talk also about interventions, and there we talk about things like hydrogen, CCUS, resource and energy efficiency, and also circular economy. And then we can also take a place-based approach, because as Stefan has just noted, industry is concentrated often in particular places, but so also are the opportunities for some decarbonisation interventions. So opportunities for carbon capture and storage depend on suitable geologies. Opportunities for offshore wind depend on access to offshore wind. And strategy for industrial decarbonisation, therefore, sits at the intersection of these different areas. So industrial strategy is where countries decide actually what industries they want to invest in and prioritise, and what places they want to invest in and prioritise for industry. Infrastructure planning and deployment is where we decide where we want to do things like situate carbon capture and storage or increase electrification capacity. And market creation are those areas which we've touched on also, like carbon border adjustment mechanisms, product standards, business models for different market pool, essentially, for decarbonisation. So that's my starting point for this talk. And the UK approach to industrial decarbonisation has so far been very place-based. And industry is not the largest sector. It's nowhere close to China's industrial sector, but it's about 14% of industrial emissions. And half of these are in coastal clusters, shown on the map, often with either oil refineries or steelworks in there. The industrial decarbonisation strategy set out approach, which therefore very much focused on these carbon-intensive areas, talking about carbon capture and storage and hydrogen for them. And that's through two main initiatives: one to bid for funding, one to build capacity through plans. But there is limited focus on the half of industrial emissions outside of these clusters. And particularly when we talk about acceleration of industrial decarbonisation, we really need to move beyond the hotspots to consider the entire sector. So previous work then, which I think I presented 3 years ago to this meeting, talked about the work that I'd done with my colleagues Peter Taylor and Ahmed Galani for UKirk about the challenges facing sites outside clusters. And these are broadly here: lack of funding, lack of knowledge, lack of organisational capacity, and lack of access to infrastructure. Now, things happily have moved on in the last 3 years. A competition was announced last year and began this year, asking sites outside clusters, and this is a map showing where they are, they're all across the country, to bid for funding to develop local plans for industrial decarbonisation. So importantly, not funding for research, not funding for infrastructure, but simply, can you build us a plan to say how the industry in your area might decarbonise? So ongoing research then, but 13 places bid, and the call was deliberately wide. And I think what surprised policymakers was just how diverse the areas were and the types of industry covered were. So the smallest project down here in green is 5 businesses. And the largest project up here is in Northern Ireland, and it covers the whole of the country. That's one of the 4 nations of the UK, and that's 1.3 million people. So vastly different in terms of scale. Practically every industrial sector was represented, from the ones we expect: steel, cement, chemicals, down to much more kind of lower carbon intensity industries. Businesses ranged from very small companies, maybe less than 10 people, to multinationals, and the lead organizations of these projects also changed. So there's a real issue here about how we essentially try to bring this huge diversity of industry together, which I think perhaps you only understand once you start taking a more localized approach. And I've broadly categorized these into projects which have definite boundaries, which are things like ports or industrial estates on one end, and ports projects which essentially cover entire regions at the other end, and in the middle, projects which cover cities, which tend to have a mixture of different industry types. So that's just how I thought about it. All of the projects took much the same approach, which was first of all trying to engage with their local industry, then trying to collect data from their local industry in order to build models, which they then are now at this stage sharing with their stakeholders to develop a local plan. So that's essentially is what they're attempting to do. And I think what they found therefore shines a light on some of the kind of more operational issues of actually how to decarbonize industry. And essentially the first finding is that, why do companies get involved? Why are they interested in local industrial decarbonisation? And generally the places that are involved now have previously worked together. That was the key finding. It wasn't necessarily about the concentration of their industry. It was the fact they had a previous network which made them think, actually locally we might be able to do something. And that was the case across all the different factors. So it's about mature local networks, and it's about having a pre-existing team, which is good for those places which have that capacity, but difficult for those places which do not. Once we got out into the field, it has been really challenging for these projects to engage with local industry. First of all, simply in identifying their local industry. You know, they have a region, they want to talk to industry. They can't always find them. They can't always identify who their biggest local emitters are. And this is particularly a case for small and medium enterprises, which we define as businesses less than 50 employees. But essentially, it's a problem across the piece. And so once you get past these big, heavy industries, these multinational emitters, into the more local area, engaging with people has been a real challenge. And as one stakeholder says there, essentially, there doesn't seem to be enough pull from the market to actually make these people engage. So, you know, first of all, identify your industry, challenge one. And the second major issue that everyone has reported is simply trying to get your energy data out of your industry. And that has been twofold. A lot of businesses, and this surprises us, but a lot of businesses are not routinely recording their energy use. If they have to report it for suppliers, they are. If they are perhaps needing to report it for carbon border adjustment mechanisms for the EU, because it is now a requirement to report, they are. But for smaller businesses, they don't necessarily have that data. And for larger businesses, they may have that data, but they don't necessarily want to share it because they think it might give away competitive advantage. And this is a real issue when you're trying to develop a local decarbonisation decarbonisation plan for industry, where you need to know what your future demand for hydrogen might be, or your future demand for electrification might be, or what your opportunities are for resource and energy sharing, if the businesses don't actually want to provide that information because they think it may disadvantage them. So broadly then, there are opportunities and challenges across the different projects. A broader remit, a broader lens, an entire country gives you a big audience, and you can build momentum. But identifying your key stakeholders is challenging. And if you identify your top 20% of key stakeholders who are engaged, that's good, but it doesn't really give you a whole area decarbonisation. The bounded clusters like ports and industrial estates have a captive audience of people they should be able to speak to, and they have landlord involvement, which is often very useful when you're talking about things like the possibilities for putting solar panels on buildings to decarbonise those areas. The owners of the buildings need to agree, but they are having real problems with IP and data sharing, intellectual property and data sharing, and they are facing site-specific infrastructure constraints. And in the UK in particular, this is often around electrification, which is meant to be the next big step for industry. But if there isn't headroom in the local network to decarbonise, then people have real issues. There may be a 10-year wait to upgrade the network. And finally, the urban clusters. So these are in cities, but cities are very diverse. So one cluster is in Oxford, which is quite a well-known city dominated by a university, very old buildings, quite space constrained. Others are in places like Bradford, which is very much a more industrial city, with a kind of different locations of industry, but they both face issues around building age. So we might want to upgrade our buildings, but if you're in a city and you have a 200-year-old building, there are limitations there. They have space limitations for things like where you might put batteries, and they have a real mixture of industries, the locations, and how concentrated they are. And so finally, then, what can we learn from local industrial decarbonisation plans, particularly when we start thinking about acceleration, which by definition must go beyond big clusters to smaller sites? Undoubtedly, the plans have raised the profile of local industrial decarbonisation, which often wasn't on people's radar at all. So this is positive. We understand, though, the factors which make places bid for funding and win funding. That doesn't necessarily mean that they will be the places that are best at decarbonising their industry, which we get to the tricky implementation stage. So that, I think, is something to bear in mind. We know that once we get down to the nitty-gritty of decarbonisation, sharing data and standardisation of practices, it's going to be absolutely essential once we try to move into actually decarbonising our industry. But, and this touches what the other speakers said too, state-led approaches, some kind of carrot and stick, are going to be necessary. So place-based approaches are going to be important to decarbonising industry, but this market creation, please here, be that product standards, be that carbon border adjustment mechanisms, be that green procurement, these are also going to be key and needed additionally to a place-based approach. So that, I think, is what I have to say, and I'm looking forward to any discussions on the panel session.
Yes, thank you, Imogen. Very interesting, and maybe also one question to your side. We also know that localities, cities, municipalities are also very important politically, and you stressed also that the national government has, of course, also an important role to play. So, do you see momentum built from the local levels that really pushes national governments, for example, in the UK, to go ahead with that?
I think it's an interesting question. We do see push from the local levels, particularly in the very carbon intensive areas, which know this is potentially an existential threat to their livelihoods. So yes, we do see push from here. I think the city focus, though, certainly in the UK, is less so because most of our industry is in cities. As a kind of deindustrializing country with the large service economy, for the most part, our industry has moved out of cities. So there is a lot of focus in UK policies on cities, but that isn't necessarily where the industry is. And I think that's something we have to bear in mind for future policy.
Yes, thank you. And maybe also an aspect for the upcoming IPCC report on cities to also check the interaction with industry. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Morgan. Thank you all to the three great speakers. I learned a lot, and it was all very much in time. So we still have 15 minutes left for our discussion. which is quite some time, but given the number of people we have here is also limited. So maybe we can keep it concise. And I would really love to start. Maybe you can all those speakers involved can switch on their camera, then the audience can see all of us and knows who is talking. And while you are doing that, I would like maybe to put some questions. Maybe first we start with Rahul Pandey from Indian Institute of Management. And Rahul, I think, I guess you are here. I can't see you
Yes,
yet.
hi, Stephen. Can you hear me?
Hi, great.
Yeah.
Great to hear you. So we have heard now from different countries on industrial transition, and of course we all know that India is a very important country, very big country, which looks forward to expand industry a lot and currently is very much coal-based, so facing many challenges. So maybe what's the perspective from your side, coming from India? How do you look at the perspective we have heard so far?
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Yeah, so as you rightly said, India is still dominantly coal-based, and yes, so things are, it's a mixed story from India, Stephen. So while the government has set a target of net zero by 2070, as you all know, but on the ground, we don't see much concerted action. There are companies, individual companies who are claiming some actions, but then again, it's a mixed story. For instance, just to give you an example, one of the largest cement companies in India is simultaneously investing in solar, not cement companies, one of the largest corporate groups in India, probably the largest, is simultaneously investing in solar as well as coal. So they are aggressive on both the fronts. So that is the kind of contradiction you see in India. So while they're investing in renewable technologies, but they're also not scaling down on the fossil fuels. On the ground, that's the broad thing that we see. And there's a lack of concerted action is how I would put it. Although individually, there are a few companies who are probably taking some good action. Yeah.
Okay, yes, thank you. And what do you think of the perspective? I mean, in some regions of the world, we see due to the crisis, so fragmentation, maybe even rollback. How do you perceive the Indian trajectory?
I don't know how to answer that question, but Stefan, a different point that I would like to add is I come from business management academics. I'm part of academia, and also I'm part of a private company that offers some analytical tools to companies for planning. So the way I see it is that so some of the points that were raised by the previous speakers, I found them quite relevant. Especially the fact that from the market side, we still don't see enough pull, and companies have to make a case for competitive advantage, right? So the same problem we see in India. In India, that problem is big because companies still it takes a lot of effort to convince them of this investments in sustainability and low carbon and making an economic or business case for that. And I'm sure that is at the global level also, as some of the speakers said. And so therefore, one perspective I would like to add to what people have said already is that the business perspective and the supply chain perspective. Because in the markets it is the supply chains that compete, and even the large companies realize that and they already have been for several years trying to control their supply chains to improve the performance in the marketplace, right? And they have certain data systems, certain technology systems, certain processes to manage the supply chains, right? And a big gap that I see is that the sustainability and low carbon goals are not integrated in those processes for example, managing the data, managing their supply chain planning, demand planning, etc. So so that is a big gap, so that the sustainability actions happen independent of their normal processes of managing the business and the supply chains. And we need to find ways to integrate integrate those.
Yes, thank you. That also, I think, relates to what we heard, that really demand side policies, supply chain markets has been has to be emphasized much more in the future and has been little attention paid to in the past. Maybe Kentaro, looking over to you, coming from Japan. So what would be your perspective on the industrial transition and how to accelerate? We all know that Japan is also actively working on industrial policy, and what are your aspects to share with us?
Yeah, thank you very much, Stefan. From my side, I don't really touch upon the Japan's specific industrial policy, but also I just try to point out some general concern about its current situation. That means, as we already discussed, there are a lot of various initiatives for decarbonization, but particularly industrial decarbonization, and many countries actually taking some green industrial policies. These are good things, but on the other hand, I think many of these policies have kind of a protectionist features, such as local content requirement, others. So these are not really good news. And also a growing geopolitical tension also cause some challenges for industrial decarbonization, particularly in the United States and the EU and also in Japan. There is some, growing effort to establish China-free supply chain of key clean technology and critical minerals. So such effort includes the cost of industrial transition and slow down the pace of industrial transition. So these should be, I think, need to be addressed. And also when we discuss or when we take the action, we have to take into account these kind of worrisome development. And that's it from my side. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for pointing out this really very important development on say protectionist tendencies, fragmentation of markets, which of course will cost us efficiency and wealth in the end, and also geopolitical power in the play. So do you see also opportunities or solutions to change that or to overcome that?
Yeah, I think this is geopolitical kind of politics tension, geopolitical tension. I think very, very, I think kind of root problem. So not that easy to address directly, but at least we have to find some, areas where we can find some area to cooperate across the country. I think which could include some standardization for green technology, green products, green hydrogen, others. And also, if possible, it's not that easy, but if you some cooperation for create some demand for green technology, particularly. So these collaboration could be possible and even under some geopolitical tension. Yeah. That's it.
Yeah, thank you for these ideas, very important ones. I would like to open, particularly with this question, to the other speakers. So are there other ideas or observations, particularly around this topic on how to collaborate internationally in the future? Because I agree to you, Kentaro, that's a very crucial aspect and something that could challenge advances in the future. So,
Sorry,
Frank, are you going to say something to it? I'm not sure. Yeah. Please,
if I may, I would love to come in on that. So the political argument against this protectionist measures is a bit, of course, that we clearly see out there some regions with unique situations, combinations of availability of renewables, critical raw materials that most likely provide quite significant cost advantages compared to, let's say, other regions in the world to produce low carbon materials and inputs. So for many of the countries that at the moment are undergoing these, let's say, tests of more protectionist policy approaches, it would be clearly, from my perspective, a hedging strategy against the domestic higher costs of low carbon production to keep at least segments of the markets open to allow for trade of green intermediate products, but also green products overall. I think this is a key element. But what we are lacking here, and this is from my perspective, a thing that the research community needs still to deliver answers, is proof that there could be also macroeconomic wins of strengthening downstream competitiveness value chains with lower cost inputs for low carbon materials. So to generate net positive effects on downstream manufacturing value chains, where so far haven't seen little research being done. And this would be something really where really the community could help, the research community could help to really display also this kind of win-win narrative that we are expecting between, let's say, some partnerships of resource-rich, renewable-rich countries with, let's say, the global north, heavy manufacturing countries, to outline these potential effects of such green trade. And here I think some more quantitative evidence would be very helpful also to foster and support the political debate.
Yes, thank you. I think that's a very important idea to think of those countries that might benefit from such a development, maybe Namibia, Chile, South Africa. But I think that on the one hand, that's a macroeconomic and value chain thing. On the other hand, also, I think it's very important for those countries to develop models that it really creates local development, local industrial development, not only experts. So maybe, Imogen, you might have ideas on that, how that could work, because I think that's probably very crucial because we do not want to have neo-colonialistic structures in this development. Probably that will not be the solution. Do you have ideas from your experience on that?
It is a tricky question, and I agree with Frank that there hasn't been essentially a lot of research done on this. I think one idea floating around is that carbon border adjustment mechanisms should be used to assist finance from carbon border adjustment mechanisms could be used to assist finance developments in other countries, and this would seem to be a more equitable approach. From a more local perspective, and this doesn't directly answer the question, but I think it's important because it's not just about materials, it's also about skills and the availability of local skills. And essentially, certainly in the UK, we do not have the skills we need for the low carbon transition. We need a lot more electrical engineers and we need a lot more people who can do things like construction and building. And so I think nationally, internationally, if we are to remove the inequity of essentially a brain drain where developed countries export all the skilled labor from developing countries to decarbonize their own industry, we do need to start investing heavily in skills at a national level. So I think, my take on it, finance perhaps through mechanisms such as carbon border adjustment mechanisms, but also investment in our own capacities so we do not potentially drain skills from other places.
Yes, thank you. Very important aspect. Maybe I turn as a last speaker to Isadora. China, of course, has an important role. Some people concerned about some policies there. Kantao mentioned that. Luckily, we are here together and working together and still in many aspects. So how do you see it from maybe, can you tell something from a Chinese perspective or from your insights from China on that?
Sure. Thank you, Stefan, everyone, for the sharing. I think from China's perspective, both at the government level and the industry sector practitioner level, the level of openness stays the same. Like there is still a very strong demand from China to cooperate, keep the collaboration with other countries, especially now with the upcoming Trump administration, like many of the local level and among the young generation, people are starting to doubt, the climate change fight and whether there will be a fallback from led by the United States. I think this is now a very crucial era that China, Japan, European countries stay together and keep the Paris Agreement goals, and still enhancing our NDCs and also efforts to lead toward 1.5 degree temperature rise. As to the value chain level and industry level, I personally would totally understand the the diversification of supply chain, not relying solely on China because of the supply security. China has the same concerns, in its oil and gas supply. This is universal everywhere. The Chinese government is also understandable of this. It's just that China has benefited from globalization in the past 20 years, for growth. So we from the government perspective, the Chinese government is really keen to keep to keep the fruits there and also keep going along the globalization way and expand the gains. I think if we could not, keep the collaboration as before, at least we could do co-investment in third countries, or shifting out some of the manufacturing capacities into Vietnam or other Southeast Asian emerging economies, with both Chinese presence and other investments from Japan, Korea, UK, or Germany, India, and emerging economies. I think that's totally possible.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you also to bringing us back to the very big picture. And I think that's also very important for the overall meeting of the LCS-RNet, which is about how can we accelerate actions to stay within 1.5 degrees. Jim Skea also already in his speech clearly said what that means and how important it is. And so many thanks for all of you for these great inputs, great thoughts, and interesting debate. I could discuss a lot more, but our time is over. So thanks a lot. Also, thank you to the organizers, and looking forward to the next session. And I hand over to Tomoko.
Thank you, Stefan and speakers.
Thank you very much.
So we are going to have a short break here, and we will resume today's second session on agriculture and forestry in climate resilient strategy at 11:15 in UK and 12:15 in Central Europe time, and then the 8:15 in Japan. Thank you very much. So next up is a session entitled Agriculture and Forestry in Climate Resilience Strategy, Innovations and Best Practices. We'd like to invite Dr. Alessandra De Marco and then Dr. Sergio Lamotta, and from the Italian National Agency for New Technologies and Energy and Environment, ENER, as co-chairs of the session. So Alessandra and Sergio, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tomoko. It's nice to be here, and it's nice to organize this session in the Low Carbon Society meeting, and I thank the organizer for this opportunity. During this session, we have two different talks, and we invited two panelists. The idea is to focus on different local policies to facilitate decarbonization at the city level and the agricultural level, but using we will focus in particular on the urban forest in the first talk, and in the second talk we will look at local policies to accelerate the climate action. Sergio, if you want to introduce yourself, you want to say something, please?
Okay, thank you, Alessandra, for the for the opportunity. Okay, I'm the previous, so to say, steering committee member of Low Carbon Society from Italy, and now I'm happy to take over to you, Alessandra. I'm sure that you will do an excellent job. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergio. Okay, so we can start because the time is not a lot. So we can start with the first speaker. That is my friend and colleague, Elena Poletti. She's a senior scientist in the CNR in Italy, and she's the vice president of the major network of forest research organization in the world, that is the UFRO, and she's a member of the board for the European Forest Institute, and the skill are on air pollution, climate change, and forests. So Elena, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alessandra. Thank you for the invitation to speak on this important subject. I now share my presentation. Hope you can see.
Yes.
Okay. Can you see in presentation mode? Hopefully. Okay. So I'm Elena Paoletti from the Institute of Research on Terrestrial Ecosystems of the National Council of Research of Italy, which is the biggest institution of public research in Italy, my country. And today I'm talking about the urban forest as a tool for climate resilient strategies. And this information is mostly coming from two projects. The Airfresh project, which is a LIFE project, namely dedicated to air pollution removal by urban forest for a better human well-being, and from the National Biodiversity Future Center project, which is funded from the European Community Post-COVID Recovery Fund. And this is a collaborative work. You can see several collaborators from different institutions, including Enea and ACRI in France. Okay, why the cities? Because the urban footprint has been increasing dramatically since the 21st century. The global urban population has grown very, very quickly and at a much faster rate than the total population, so that the urban areas are now welcoming 58% of the global population, so more than half of the global population. And by 2050, we estimate that the cities will reach around 68% of total population. And actually, the urban areas cover a very limited land area, just 3%, around 3%. And if we look at trees, which is, say, the subject of our presentation today, they are in the cities just 0.1% of the global trees. So apparently, they may have a limited impact, but actually the cities are the core of the global footprint because they use 70% of total energy, emit 75% of traditional pollutants, and 75% of carbon emissions that are not offset. They consume 80% of global water, 80% of global food, and produce 85% of total waste. So these are really impressive and concerning numbers. Oh, sorry. In detail, if we look at the impact of urban expansion on vegetation, we can say that, of course, such large-scale urban expansion encroaches on ecologically productive lands. And this is obviously resulting in a reduction of the global vegetation cover, in a loss of agricultural land, in a loss of natural habitats, including forests. Urban expansion triggers localized climate change, so that the ecosystem structure and function are affected, negatively affected, and the vegetation productivity is also reduced. In particular, elevated tropospheric CO2 concentration, as well as higher temperatures and increased atmospheric and nitrogen deposition caused by the urban heat island, may affect the growth and development of the vegetation in the cities. But all these changes are up to now insufficiently investigated. If we have a look at the results of a recent paper on the quantification of the impacts of urban expansion on vegetation, we see that there are negative impacts, of course, due to the extensive natural green vegetation conversion into artificial impervious surfaces that has been estimated to affect nitrogen net ecosystem production over an area of more than 320,000 square kilometers globally. There are also, of course, some positive impacts of urban expansion, such as the higher number of city vegetation, urban parks, green roofs. There is a better management of the artificial structure, and there is a positive impact of vegetation on the urban climate. Overall, the positive impact may affect net ecosystem production over an area that is estimated to be much lower than that affected negatively, that is around 87,000 square kilometers. In addition, such impacts are unequally occurring all over. In the upper map, you can see the location and city level of around 3,000 cities globally, classified from mega cities to small cities. And it's clear that there are some areas of the world that are at under higher pressure. Obviously, Europe, North America, Eastern Asia, India, but look at the number of mega cities also in Southern America and in Africa. Again, if you look at the below map, you see the spatial patterns of negative and positive impacts as defined below, as defined before. The impacts on net ecosystem productivity, and they are, of course, higher in Asia, Europe, and North America. Nowadays, a new concept is developing, the concept of biocities, where the city is conceived as a forest. So we are really going towards a radical transformation of the structure of our cities, which will take some time anyhow, where the urban forest is here defined as all woodland, all groups of trees, all individual trees that are located both into the cities and around the cities. And such urban forests are really acted at the backbone of the so-called green infrastructure, which is a bridge between rural and urban areas. And it's the backbone for the key for ameliorating the negative environmental footprint of a city. And of course, this concept is just one pillar in the larger concept of circular bioeconomy, with the society at the very core of the loop, where nature and energy interacts, and the renewable natural capital of which the urban forest is part, is the key tool for affecting cultural services, for providing cultural services, regulating services, provisioning services, and of course, biodiversity is central in this process, where biocities are due to respect the principles of the circular bioeconomy, both for bioproducts and biomass bioprocessing. We now know a great deal about global carbon sequestration in forests and soils. We have concrete figures, estimation, with the most with the richest forest in the tropical area, followed by the boreal area, and then temperate and subtropical forest. We also have concrete figures for the distribution in the individual countries, with Russia at top, followed by Brazil, Canada, USA, and China. And we also know how this carbon is distributed. It's basically half in the living biomass and half in the soil. Here we have a very major gap that is about global carbon in urban forest and soils. What about the cities? We have plenty actually of individual studies showing results for some case studies. And here I'm showing actually one of these case studies for my city, Florence, in Italy. And I hope that this example will support you in understanding the complexity of variables we require for a correct assessment of the carbon balance of the urban forest. Here, we are actually planting a new green area. We planted this area, and so we had information about all the aspects from provision of plant material to planting, to growing, to ecophysiology of the growing plants. In particular, we are assessing the net CO2 tree sequestration, which is the result of two main physiological processes: photosynthesis, which is uptaking CO2, and dark respiration, which is emitting CO2, and both are affected by environmental parameters, light, temperature, relative humidity, and CO2 in particular. Then we have to assess the emission of the impacts on the emission of CO2 in terms of CO2 equivalents, of course. And here we evaluated the carbon footprint by life cycle analysis and the soil respiration. You see here a picture of the test area. Is just a small new forest planted in Florence with 5 different species selected for very positive impacts on air quality. So here you see the requirements of measurements for the estimation of net CO2 tree sequestration, in particular the light and CO2 response curves, the measurements of photosynthesis and dark respiration that are collated into the below algorithm for a standard modeling, a standard estimation of sequestration. This information is then scaled up from the leaf level to the tree level. So we need for that the tree size parameters, say height, diameter at breast height, leaf area index, leaf mass per area, total leaf area. And the estimation we made was from planting to the age of 50 years, in the next 50 years from planting. And this is how we applied the life cycle analysis, estimating the CO2 emitted due to the nursery cultivation, the transport of the plants from the nursery to the area of planting, the digging and planting itself activities, and the maintenance due to fertilization, pruning, irrigation, and the mowing. And that's one of the results. You can see the carbon footprint resulting in a significant emission of CO2 equivalents, especially during the phase of maintenance. If we split the phase of maintenance, we see that mowing is the most critical aspect. This is a urban forest, of course, so there is a need to maintain the aspect of the park in a way that people can actually enjoy and walk through the park itself. So mowing is in such a case very demanding. Here you see how we assess and measure soil respiration, which is variable over the day and over the season. You see these are actual field measurements followed by a modeling activity. And that's the main result. So over the city life, 50 years on right, and an inset on left, the first 20 years. We modeled based on the meteorological data, the soil temperature of actual record, based on actual measurements for 2 years. We applied 3 climate scenarios, and we see that basically for the first 13 years, the carbon balance and the CO2 balance is negative, and then the forest becomes a net sink of CO2. So from this case study, we can conclude that life cycle analysis is actually an excellent tool to understand, to untangle which are the most critical phases in the restoration of urban forest and the maintenance of urban forest, with grass mowing as the most impactful activity. Also, soil respiration was a significant CO2 emission factor, especially because Florence is in the Mediterranean area, so soil respiration is quite important process. The 13 years here determined are just a tentative figure, of course, and apply just to this case study, but I think that this information may be extremely helpful for stakeholders and local administrations that aims to target the goal of carbon neutrality in their cities. Overall, we are aware that urban forests provide a variety of benefits to citizens, not only carbon. They provide, for instance, noise reduction, control on soil erosion, shading, and thus also energy saving, control on climate, not only because of shading, but also because of evapotranspiration, psychological and physical benefits for citizens that can enjoy the green areas, habitat for biodiversity, and also air quality improvement. CO2 actually is just maybe considered also as a pollutant together with tropospheric ozone, nitrogen dioxide, and particulate matter that in addition have harmful effects on citizens' human health. One negative impact here concerning air quality is due to the emission of volatile organic compounds from vegetation. These compounds are basically hydrocarbons that are active in the troposphere. They react with other pollutants, in particular other nitrogen oxides coming from vehicular traffic, and they may form secondary pollutants, in particular ozone and aerosol, that are toxic to people. So the selection of urban trees is also an important tool for protecting not only for providing not only carbon sequestration and climate control, but also for providing a proper protection of human health. Overall, however, the impacts of such important global services, in particular carbon sequestration, climate control, and air quality amelioration, are still to be evaluated at the global level. Here, we demand for more attention from research and policymaking. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Elena, for your presentation, and due to time reason, okay, it's better to go to the next speaker. That is Dr. Yugo Tanaka, that is research manager at the IGES, the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, and they have been working on accelerating climate action at the local level through facilitating science-based dialogues among local stakeholders. So, Hugo, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
My name is Yugo Tanaka from Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, Japan. And let me share my screen. Today I'm going to talk about agrivoltaics, some case studies in agrivoltaics in Japan. And I would say that it can be used as a tool for sustainable land use and agricultural production. The previous presentation was mainly focused on urban area, but my presentation would be on the rural areas on the contrary. So the agriculture sector and land use sector is a huge contributor of carbon emissions, and decarbonization of the agriculture sector and transformation to sustainable land use is unquestionably important. So on the graph on the left-hand side shows globally agricultural land use has quadrupled compared to the pre-industrial level. This has been the key threat to the loss of biodiversity and carbon sink. However, I think we need to keep in mind that developed countries have a bit different context to developing countries. For example, in Japan, particularly in rural areas, underutilization of farmlands is the issue, which has been threatening biodiversity and agriculture production. The graph on the right hand shows that the share of abandoned farmland has been expanding in Japan, and this is an average picture. So if we focus on rural areas, it would be much worse. And agriculture in Japan has several characteristics. Area of cultivated land per management entities is significantly small compared to other countries. And this is similar in some parts of the developing Asia. It results in low productivity of the sector and low income. And also age composition of farms is very unbalanced, with almost 70% of farmers in Japan is more than 65 years old. And although agricultural land plays an important essential role in protecting natural environment, including maintaining biodiversity, cleaning water, increasing resilience to natural disasters, carbon sequestration, etc., working in agricultural sector and living in agricultural areas are less attractive to other options. And this drives the trend of less utilization of farmlands in rural areas. Farmlands are not easily allowed to use for other purposes, even if they are abandoned. So these lands go into ruin, and deers and wild boars start to live there. Increase of abundant farmlands brings negative feedback to other cultivated area through the increase of wildlife damage and difficulty of maintaining infrastructure. So requiring decarbonization effort to agriculture sector in Japan must comply with this another urgent sustainability issue of the sector. So agrivoltaics are growing in many parts of the world, but let me highlight this concept was initially invented in Japan. The idea behind this was the theory of light saturation point, which implies sunlight in farmlands can be partly used for solar power generation as long as sufficient level of sunlight is secured for plants. We in Japan sometimes refer to agrivoltaics as solar sharing. This concept was developed with the intention to increase the productivity of each farmland. Importantly, there is a regulation that frames and panels must be placed higher than farmers and machines, for example, 3 meters high. At the same time, sufficient level of sunlight is secured. For example, panels must be placed with sufficient gaps so that agriculture production will not be obstructed. At the same time, farmers need to report annual crop yield to authority, and if it is less than 80% of the average yield of the area, agrivoltaics facility must be removed. So, however, because of the aforementioned reasons, there are not so many farmers who can guarantee the sufficient level of crop yield until 10 or 15 years ahead. This is one of the key challenges to implement agrivoltaics in Japan. Let me share some insights from Japan. First, the case of Sosa highlights the possibility of agrivoltaics to address the issue through strengthening the relationship between metropolitan area and agricultural area. Sosa city is located 70 kilometers away from Tokyo, and aging and decrease of farmers have been causing rapid expansion of abandoned farmlands. Citizen Energy Chiba, so-called Min-Ene, has developed a lot of agrivoltaics projects in the region utilizing abandoned farmlands, as some examples shown in the slide. Uniqueness of these projects is the diversity of stakeholders involved. Some projects were funded by individual citizens and innovator groups or large conventional companies. They often organize events, include inviting stakeholders and others to the farms in order to increase the number of people engaging their activities. Farms are cultivated by a newly established farming company for which some new entry farmers start to work with experienced farmers. This implies agrivoltaics may be used as a tool to connect rural area with metropolitan area through the exchange of financial and human resources, food, and electricity. Another example is an agrivoltaics on the roof of protected horticulture, a Farm Do group, which has a strength in logistics and direct marketing of vegetables and crops around Tokyo metropolitan area, has invested more than 40 horticulture facilities by themselves and created jobs in suburb areas. Solar helps to reduce their emissions, and revenue from solar stabilizes profitability. And also, they build residence for weekend farmers in the suburb area to increase the number of people engaging to agriculture. So in addition to such revenue increase, other benefits can also be expected from the agrivoltaics through creating microclimate under the facility, protecting soil from over evaporation, and reducing excessive sunlight that might cause quality damage to product as well as heat shock or cancer, skin cancer to farmers. However, in spite of such potential benefits, agrivoltaics are currently not very welcome in many parts of Japan. This is partly because generous policy support on renewable energy triggered rapid expansion of solar, and there have been many bad examples of agrivoltaics installed, mainly for power generation, which place less importance and respect on agriculture. Actually, almost 20% of cases have been revealed to obtain less agricultural yield compared to the regulatory requirement. In addition, even if annual yield satisfies the standard, in many cases these farms cultivate shade-tolerant plants such as sakaki, Japanese ginger, and mushrooms, which were not very popular before agrivoltaics was installed. So we have been supporting municipalities to consider how they can utilize agrivoltaics technologies to address local and global sustainability issues. And let me highlight the case of Awaji Island. Awaji Island is located just in front of Kobe City, the eighth populated city in Japan, and is prosperous in agriculture, although the region has relatively good access to metropolitan area. Awaji Island has established a vision in 2010 to achieve carbon neutrality and energy independency through renewable energy introduction, at the same time to reduce abundant farmlands and increase the number of farmers in the region. Through strategic branding and providing opportunity for non-farmers to engage agriculture. So far, these approaches have not been well integrated, and although renewable energy has expanded, the majority was large-scale solar built and operated by entities outside the region. It started to cause conflicts with local communities as the landscape spoiling infrastructure owned by unidentified entity did not bring any benefit to the region, and farmers have received annoying aggressive sales from agrivoltaics companies. Farmers are also worrying about potential productivity loss due to the agrivoltaic facility. In addition, the economic attractiveness of agrivoltaics has decreased as solar generation became less profitable due to increased curtailment because the electricity grid was relatively weak. So on the other hand, abandoned farmlands have been expanding very fast. So together with the local community, we first assessed the current status of abandoned farmlands through analyzing the satellite data and assessed the potential of agrivoltaics, at the same time showcased some potential business models that might work in the region. The stakeholder engagement helped to identify the feasible way to benefit both renewable energy introduction as well as agriculture production. Based on the debate, we suggested that the local authority aggregates and redevelops abandoned farmlands and rent it to the companies who wish to start farming in Awaji Island, where those who incorporate renewable energy into their plan will be prioritized in the selection process. So for the next step, we suggested to conduct a locally led demonstration project so that we can confirm agriculture production is not inhibited by agrivoltaics in the local conditions. And also local farmers can see and realize how agrivoltaics works and benefit them. At the same time, we conducted a scenario analysis to analyze the path to achieve carbon neutrality, which helped to confirm the importance of agrivoltaics. However, based on the results of our detailed power system simulation analysis, we identified that it must come with some approaches to help grid integration of variable renewables, because electricity generation from solar will be significantly larger than the load requires. Currently, we are suggesting to have a demonstration project in Awaji Island to understand the impact of agrivoltaics and crop yields. And hopefully, we think it would be interesting if we can demonstrate perovskite models, which is demonstrated by other Japanese companies, Terra and Sekisui Chemical Corporation, because it has some unique features that might help solving issues that the Awaji Island faces. So it is flexible, and the lens shape of the module will help produce more flat electricity output compared to the conventional panels. And also it is light, it has less weight, that helps to reduce the need for supporting structure and pillars. So it would help agriculture, it will help farmers to work under the facility. And we think this can be a potential solution. So I would sum up, decarbonization of agriculture sector and transformation to sustainable land use should come with sustainable agriculture. Agrivoltaics may help it through increasing revenue and resilience, although associated risks needs to be managed. And particularly for rural areas in Japan, agrivoltaics can be used as a tool to attract people from metropolitan areas, strengthening relationship to exchange resources, which enables sustainable agriculture in the declining population. Efforts are needed to help local society to overcome barriers through presenting evidences and facilitating dialogues among different stakeholder groups. More research is on the benefits of agrivoltaics as an adaptation measure and on the ways to ensuring crop yields are needed. So this is the end of my presentation. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation, introducing the agrivoltaic and the concept in rural area. So now we have the panel with the two panelists, Dr. Tomoko Asegawa from Ritsumeikan University, the pronunciation is correct, and Dr. Roberto Farina from NAS institution of myself. And to lead the discussion, even in consideration of the two presentations, I want to ask two questions to the panelists and even to the speakers if they want to make intervention on this. So the first question is if we as a developed country, are we doing enough in our cities to reduce the impacts of climate change? And if our policies developed in our countries are applicable in underdeveloped countries. So, so the floor is yours to the panelists. If you have a comment on this question, please.
So, can I start?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So can I start with my comments on these presentations?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you for our insightful presentation for Elena and also Yugo. So I'm personally working on the economic and integrated assessment models at global scale for climate mitigation. So from such a perspective, I would like to share some thoughts on the land-based climate mitigation strategies. So, and land-based strategies such as afforestation are important for absorbing the atmospheric carbon dioxide as well as climate resilience, as Elena introduced. However, if a large amount of plantation and reforestation is uncarefully implemented, they can come with some significant trade-offs. So these options require vast amount of land, and which often leads to the land competition, for example, with agricultural lands for food production. That might increase of hunger risks. And also, Elena shows land competition between the urbanization and forestry. And also, such development of land for these purposes could result in the biodiversity loss. However, these adverse impact, negative impact, doesn't say we shouldn't abandon these mitigation strategies, because climate impact on the food and ecosystems are quite severe. So benefits of the climate mitigation options often exceed the trade-offs. So I would like to say, so I and also Elena maybe also need to emphasize that we need our integrated approach to consider both benefits and the trade-offs. And also we need to complementary and win-win solutions to mitigate such trade-offs between climate mitigation as well as other aspects of environment. So here is some examples of such complementary approaches. The first, for example, for food systems, so there is a production side and consumption side measures that could help reduce the competition for land. For example, improving the land productivity and dietary shift, and promoting the food trade and producing in the area suitable for land. That can be minimize the need for land expansion. And regarding the biodiversity, so options like natural forest regeneration or careful forest type selections, and also appropriate site choices for afforestation can be effective. So here, Elena introduced the land competition between urbanization and forestry. And she also used the LCA approach and to show the adverse impact of afforestation on fertilizer or electricity use for grass mowing. That's interesting. And that might be some trade-offs with between the climate mitigations and other such environmental issues. So from the food and the land perspectives, so combining these things could reduce the dependence on the land and minimize trade-offs. And also Hugo introduced solar sharing between the solar PV with crop cultivation. That would be one good solution to reduce land pressure, land competition, while reducing emissions. So in conclusion, so increasing the co-benefits and addressing the trade-offs requires a nuanced understanding and a combination of strategies that harmonize with climate mitigation with land sustainability. So thank you very much. You're muted.
Sorry, thank you, Tomoko. I think that partially you answered to the question. If we are doing enough to reduce the impacts of climate change in developed countries.
Okay.
And on this, I want to ask the second panelist, Roberto Farina, if he has other comments.
Yeah, you asked about the legislation, and I think that at least in Europe, we have developed quite good legislation since several years, and sometimes we did some probably we did some mistake in the development of the legislation. The example of the automotive that provided quite big discussion for the equality is an example, and we don't find a correct solution. But regarding, in particular, the suggestion proposed by Elena, I agree completely with the possibility to improve the green areas in the urban cities, because as a specialist in the water management, we are developing similar ideas on that side, because there is a strict link between the air quality and the water quality and the water management also in the cities when the cities became more green. Green roof and other green infrastructures can reduce several risks in the cities. The albedo can reduce the albedo, that is already mentioned in the presentation of Elena, but can reduce also the flooding risk, because they reduce the velocity of the water, the runoff waters, and in this way the problem of the risk of flooding is completely reduced, largely reduced, and we can even reduce the problem of the subsidence of most of the cities, because the cities normally provide a impermeable area above the city, under the city, sorry. if we can maintain the water in the city for a longer period, and we provide a sort of wheel or trench that we can allow the water to infiltrate under the soil of the city, we can reduce the risk of the subsidency of in the cities. And this is, I think it is a good approach. On the other side, the city need the treatment of another aspect, sorry, is that even these green areas require large quantity of water because normally they need water to grow, to live. And the possibility to store the water, the rainwater, or even the gray water coming from the buildings, the residential buildings, is a possibility to provide the water during the dry period. So with this kind of infrastructures, we can use for the rain periods, but even for the dry periods. And this is particularly interesting, I think, for the development of the city. The main problem that I see in the application of these approaches is that most of the European cities, but even around the world, is already constructed. And it is much more difficult to introduce a green area in a building in a city where there are historical buildings or large historical areas. And this is really difficult. If I take the example of Italy, I think that 80% of the Italian cities have difficulties to realize a green roof in the residential buildings already existing for several reasons, not only for the historical reasons. So this could be an aspect, negative aspect of that can stop the realization of these green infrastructures. On the other side, the cities are growing. Several cities are still growing. We have industrial areas that are growing, and there we can think to implement this kind of infrastructures, as well as it happens normally in the developing countries, where the cities in this moment are they are growing without any control and without any kind of service. And it is possible there to think to prevent the mistakes that we did in the European or in the developed countries' cities. The other aspect that I would like to focus is the relation between the cities, the industrial areas, and the agricultural areas, because cities normally release a lot of water containing pollutants, yes, but they contain even a lot of nutrients, as well as the water. That is a quite relevant aspect for agriculture. And the possibility to recycle all these I call products, because at the end of the treatment, they are a sort of products. It is really important, and reduce the use of groundwater, for example, for in the agriculture. And the other aspect that it is important on by my side is that the nutrient contained in the treated wastewater can reduce the use of fertilizer coming or nutrients coming from the industrial side. So they can reduce the emission due from the industries. And this is an aspect that we have to focalize. The legislation, the European legislation at least, already provide a directive, regulate these aspects. And in this moment, they are changing some parameters and they are favoriting the use of the water and they stimulating the use of the nutrients. But we have to take, we still need time and discuss to better applicate this kind of approach. These are my comments, more or less.
Thank you, Roberto. So I'm sorry because it would be nice to discuss longer about this topic because it's very interesting, but I think we have to close. Time is finished. So I want to thank the organizer for this opportunity, and I want to thank even Sergio to be here. Even if he's retired, that this means that he's still interested to the activities of the low carbon society network. So I thank all the speakers, all the panelists, and all the organizers. Thanks to all.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much, Alexander, and then Sergio, for your So all the program for day one have been completed. So we'd like to thank all of you for joining this session. And day two of the annual meeting will be held at the same time tomorrow. So we hope to see you online tomorrow as well. Again, thank you very much for your participation. Bye-bye.